CQ とは何ぞや IQ とか EQ とかと何が違うのかというところから教えていただけますか？
So the definition is the ability to relate and work effectively with people who are different than you.
CQ が高いとどういうメリットがあるのか？
We worked with Goldman Sachs as part of their high potential program. So they reached out to us and talked about how they could build cultural intelligence into their 6-month high potential program. They did cultural intelligence training. They used the cultural intelligence assessment. What did they see as a result of building cultural intelligence into the program? Once they did that, now 83% of the Asian participants in the high potential program were promoted within 12 to 18 months.
例えばこの組織をより CQ を高めるために自分のアイデンティティをできるだけなくしていこう、薄くしていこう、そういう風になってしまいがちな人たちも出てくるんじゃないかなと思うんですが、そこら辺の懸念っていかがですか？皆さんこんにちは。ピボットの野島です。注目のゲストをお呼びしてキャリア、事業内情、ビジョンを深掘りするアンドトーク始まります。本日は組織文化が未来を開く、違いをパワーに変えるリーダーシップとは、こちらをテーマにアイディールリーダーズの提供でお送りいたします。では本日のゲストをご紹介いたします。Google、スターバックス、そして国連など様々な組織をコンサル、そして共同し、多様性を力に変えるリーダーシップと組織づくりを支援されてきました。カルチュラルインテリジェンスセンター創設者、デイヴィッド・リヴァモアさんです。よろしくお願いいたします。
ありがとう。
もう今言った、国の名前、そして企業の名前でもすごいなというところなんですが、今まで何カ国、そしてどれくらいのリーダーをコンサル指示してきたんでしょうか
？I've personally been to about 100 different countries, but our research has included leaders from 168 countries, so almost all of them. To date, we've surveyed the cultural intelligence of about 350,000 leaders.
Almost every country.
We're getting there.
もう本当にほぼ全ての国をというところで、それくらい、研究は多岐にわたってきているとは思うんですが、ここの、分野に携わって何年と言えるんでしょうか
？It's about 25 years that my colleagues and I have been doing the work in cultural intelligence. I know I don't look that old, but yeah.
大きな組織と小さい組織、この CQ と概念を使うときに何かアプローチ法は違うんでしょうか
？Absolutely. So the whole idea, of course, of cultural intelligence is we're adjusting and we're adapting. And I think that applies as well to organizational culture. As you can imagine, when we work with the US military, it's a very different application as compared to when we're working with Google. And to your point, if we're working with ideal leaders and you're dealing with a smaller, close-knit team, there's actually more control that an organization can have over changing the culture rather quickly than if you're a massive multinational. So yes, this is at the core of cultural intelligence. We adjust our approach, whether we're talking about national culture, size of organization, or the organizational culture itself.
まさにアジャストする、適応していくというところのキーワード出てきたわけなんですが、なぜ今 CQ というのが重要になってきているのか、なぜ今なんでしょう
？I think it's been relevant for a long time, but cultural intelligence, which we define as the ability to work with anyone from anywhere, is particularly important given that today everything is global. With your recent election, with our recent election, there's a lot of reaction against globalization, but I don't think globalization is going to go away. Check the label on the clothes that we're all wearing. They more than likely came from a variety of places around the world. COVID is an interesting example of how global we are because what started as a virus in China, suddenly we heard awful stories of what was happening in Italy, and next thing we knew, within days, we were all under lockdown. And not only is that a metaphor, it was a literal example of how global connected we are. So whether you're a small organization or a large one, you're impacted by the global economy, global trends, pop culture, supply chain, everything's global. So cultural intelligence, as I said, has been important for a long time, but particularly today, if you're in business, you're in global business in one way or another.
今の話を聞いていて、きっと CQ とは何ぞやという視聴者の方もきっといらっしゃると思うんですよね。改めて第一人者のデイビッドさんに CQ、よく聞くけど IQ とか EQ とかと何が違うのかというところから教えていただけますか？
Let's start with what it has in common with IQ and EQ, and that it is a distinct form of intelligence that can be developed and improved and measured. The difference from IQ and EQ, of course, IQ we know is a measurement of our book smarts, how cognitively smart we are. Emotional intelligence, can I detect my own emotional state and manage it in others? CQ picks up where IQ and EQ leave off, and it allows us to have that same level of success when the cultural context changes. So the definition is the ability to relate and work effectively with people who are different than you. That can be nationality, it could be gender, it could be profession, function in the organization, and we know that there are 4 different capabilities that the culturally intelligent have. And if you don't mind, I'll just mention those briefly. In the cultural intelligence assessment, we measure these 4 different skills. The first one is drive. That's the degree to which one is even interested and motivated in the first place to have an understanding of culture. How does it actually affect the way that we do business? CQ knowledge, this would be what many of us are already familiar with culture. Things like individualism versus collectivism, or power distance, or top-down leadership. So what's our understanding of some broad cultural patterns that tend to exist between one organization or another, or one nation and another? Where cultural intelligence really comes to life is in the bottom 2 squares that you see in the diagram. Strategy is our ability to take our motivation and our knowledge and actually develop a strategy that will work for a diverse workplace. And then action, this one is a really interesting dynamic because it's how do I adjust my behavior enough to be appropriate, but not go so far that it looks like, oh, you're trying a little bit too hard. Be comfortable in your own skin. So cultural intelligence is different from some other models of cultural adaptation in that we're trying to remain true to ourselves.
ではですね、もうちょっとだけこの4つを深掘っていきたいんですが、この4つの中で何が一番大事ですかと聞かれたら何て答えますか？
The number one predictor of being culturally intelligent is your curiosity.Your openness. And so the first one, CQ drive, is the most important one that you start with, which then motivates us to have the necessary knowledge, strategy, and action.
まさにこの左上のものですよね。CQ ドライブというところだと思います。土台であると。では一体我々どこら辺でつまずいているのかというのも含めですね、今日は2つ我々キーワードを用意してますので、しっかりと CQ を活用した組織づくり深掘ってまいりましょう。1つ目、CQ が求められる理由。そして2つ目は CQ ドリブンな組織づくり。こちらでお送りさせていただきます。ではまず1つ目から参りましょうか。CQ が求められる理由。そもそも CQ が重要な理由、少しだけ教えていただきましたが、何がデイビッドさんの原体験でこの CQ というものに着目したんでしょうか
？I was speaking in China for several days in a row, about 10 days straight, using an interpreter. This was a very rigorous speaking agenda, and that I was speaking 3 or 4 times a day across many different cities in China. I got to about the 3rd day of this speaking tour, and I felt like I had started to find my stride. I was through the worst of the jet lag. My interpreter and I were finding a good cadence, and I was figuring out how to talk about my content relative to the audiences. And so I started my presentation on that morning with a story. What I didn't know was that my interpreter was not translating the story. Now, I'm sure that our interpreters are translating everything that we're saying here, but the interpreter that day said, "So our speaker today is doing what a lot of North Americans do when they speak. He's telling a story that he thinks is funny." I go on and I tell the next part of the story, and she says, "I've heard him share this story earlier this week, and I don't really see how it's relevant." And I go on and tell the next part of my story, and she says, but we don't want our esteemed guest to lose face. So when he gets to the part that is funny, I'll cue you so you can laugh. And sure enough, the whole room erupts with laughter just as I tell the funny part of the story. And I think, wow, I'm very culturally intelligent. Only later had I learned what happened. And initially I thought, I don't think I can trust my interpreter anymore. But as I began to understand it, my interpreter had actually been trying to say to me, please don't share that story because it's an embarrassing story in our context. And she was trying to help me save face rather than herself. And it was a lesson for me as somebody who at that point already had a doctorate in cultural studies. I had missed a very classic point of what needed to happen here. And so it's part of what really inspired me to see that cultural intelligence isn't just about head knowledge, nor is it just about experience, but it helps us all have the capability as we're working with people day in and day out.
いや、強烈な原体験ですね。とはいえ、今、この原体験をシェアしていただいた上でですね、今、まさにグローバルエグゼクティブたちといろんな、研究であったりとか、そこへのコーチング、コンサルを行っていると思うんですね。なぜそのグローバルリーダーたちが、この CQ が重要であると思ってるんでしょうか？
It is a very relevant question because I'm in the midst of conducting a body of research asking global executives what keeps them awake at night related to culture. And we've been running focus groups in Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and North America. And there's three themes that have emerged in their conversations about what keeps them awake at night. The first one is that polycrises are the new normal. That is, no longer are you just dealing with one crisis at a time. So just as you learned that your vice president has just been hired by a competitor and it's now going to be working against you, you learn that there's also been a data breach. You find out that Trump has put in new tariffs and there's a supply chain problem, all happening at the same time with limited information. And so that's one of the reasons that global executives see it as relevant. The second one is culture is no longer as simple as Japanese and American. It has several other cultural dynamics to it. And so there's a heightened level of complexity that includes the different professions that one is involved in, the different roles that one has. And it might be something that we'll talk about a little bit later in our conversation, the different forms of diversity that exist. And then the last and third one that they talk about is particularly in places like Japan, where your authority and your role may carry a whole lot of influence. In many places where you go, suddenly your position and your authority doesn't allow you to have much leverage with a customer or client. And so they're trying to figure out how do you have influence with someone when your title might not necessarily give you the level of influence that you need or want to have. So these are all more specific ways that global executives are saying, we need something more than just cultural training that teaches us how to bow or how to pass a business card. And we need something that teaches us how we strategically account for culture's role in these kinds of situations.
では改めて、この CQ が低いとどんなリスクが出てくるのか、より具体的に言語化していただけますか？
One of the big risks of low CQ is that we lose out on opportunity and that we erode our credibility. An example of that, a few years ago, I was at a gathering like this with a group of Asian business leaders, and there was a senior vice president from a Fortune 50 US company who was presenting to the group. And as many Americans do, he continued to tell the audience how much he loves Asia. I love the food. I love the culture. I spend 200 days a year here, he said. And people to a certain degree seem to appreciate the very American love for all things Asia. But where his low CQ started to become exposed was in the questions and answers that followed. And somebody said, sir, you mentioned that you love Asia. Could you tell us a little bit about how your business strategy is different because of the time that you're spending in Asia? He gave a very vague kind of, well, we appreciate the commitment to harmony and family. And like, okay, but what have you changed about your products? He couldn't say much. Somebody else said, you're so committed as a company to Asia. Can you tell us who on your board is from Asia? And he said, Well, we meet once a quarter for just 4 hours in New York. It wouldn't be realistic to bring someone all the way from Asia in for a short period of time. And so the risk was what started out as this wonderful, I love Asia, because he lacked cultural intelligence, you started to see that he couldn't actually demonstrate very tangible ways. So his credibility was then eroded, which meant the reputation of the company's credibility was eroded as well. So that would be one specific example of where low CQ begins to cost severely, particularly if you're in a place like Asia that has so much diverse opportunities for business.
会社が危機に立たされたりとか、そのせいで機会をなくしてしまう、そこが顕在化してしまうというリスクがあるというところが整理できました。じゃあ逆に CQ が高いとどういうメリットがあるのか、そこも整理していただけますか。
There are a number of research-based benefits to high levels of cultural intelligence, both for individuals and for organizations. I'll just mention a couple of them. One is overall effectiveness, your ability to actually get your job done when the cultural context shifts. Productivity, we know that there's a heightened level of productivity when individuals have that. Employee well-being, the degree to which people feel comfortable at work and feel like their boss understands them and sees them is a tangible benefit. And then we do know more specific outcomes like profitability, cost savings, innovation. There's all kinds of links to those things as well. Perhaps I could share a concrete example of the way that cultural intelligence has helped an organization. So we worked with Goldman Sachs as part of their high potential program. So Goldman Sachs, like many companies, had a program where they brought together their top 100 high potential leaders from around the world. And one of the things that they consistently saw was that the high potential leaders from places like Europe and North America, within 12 to 18 months of being in the high potential program, they were promoted, many of them even to director level. The vast majority of the Asian participants in the high potential program were not promoted. And so there was a great concern about what we sometimes talk about as the bamboo ceiling. Why is it that these individuals who were selected for being high potential are not actually being promoted even a fraction of the rate of what the Western counterparts were? So they reached out to us and talked about how they could build cultural intelligence into their 6-month high potential program. They did cultural intelligence training. They used the cultural intelligence assessment. And one very specific thing that they did with the leaders is they were asked to leave a voicemail with a particular message to a leader in Beijing, London, and New York, and then a coach would listen to the voicemail and give them feedback and say, Sakiku-san, if I was listening to you as a typical British partner, here's what I would have heard you say. And they were getting some very tangible feedback. What did they see as a result of building cultural intelligence into the program? Once they did that, now 83% of the Asian participants in the high potential program were promoted within 12 to 18 months. Wow. So they saw a real change in their ability to demonstrate the competence and confidence that their Western counterparts were looking for. Simultaneous, I'm almost done with this very long illustration, but they also did cultural intelligence training for other executives across the firm, realizing that the responsibility wasn't all on the high potentials, but that many individuals were overlooking top talent if they weren't necessarily demonstrating Western characteristics of leadership. So that's one very concrete example of how an organization has used cultural intelligence to tangibly meet a specific outcome. This was their own program that they put together, and we were just one piece of it. And I think it's a very important piece of information. Cultural intelligence isn't usually best developed as an isolated skill over here. It's best developed when it's linked to other things like executive presence, negotiation, people management skills, things like ideal leaders do in terms of how does CQ connect to organizational purpose and understanding. So it definitely depends on the organization. And another important point of what you asked, sometimes people say, if you're measuring CQ before and after a program, how long does it need to be before you would expect to see a change? We would usually say sustained change, it's probably going to take at least 3 to 6 months. Otherwise, it might just be inflated for a moment, and then they go back to the typical ways of how they behaved when they weren't thinking about it for a short period of time.
ただもう一個お伺いしたいのは、これ人と組織、どちらを、CQ の評価と対象として見るときも、同じ基準で見るのか、つまりは2つは同じ測定方法で測れるものなのか、ここはいかがでしょうか。
There would be some difference to it. We do know that organizationals can develop capabilities like individuals can, and there is an emerging body of research looking at how you assess it, but it is a different measurement. It would not be accurate to just take the average of all the individual CQ and decide that that actually looks like the organizational CQ in it. Instead, there are three things that we look at in a CQ-driven organization. One is that the organization has linked their organizational purpose to culture, something that we can talk more about, but that sort of links to the CQ drive at an organizational level. What's their purpose? What's their mission? A second one is the degree to which there's an understanding, the CQ knowledge at the organizational level, of how diversity impacts things like decision-making, communication, and leadership. And we look at this by talking about something that we refer to as both horizontal diversity, just neutral differences between two individuals, and vertical diversity, where there might be some differences in power and status. And then thirdly, we look at it as it relates to, is it an organization that has both psychological safety, where people feel safe to interact and behave, along with intellectual honesty, where they can be forthright with their ideas, their opinions, and their constructive feedback.
今まさにおっしゃってくださったのが、組織をどうアセスメントするか、その時に3つ基準が大きくあるというところをご説明いただいたわけなんですけれども、まずは1つ目のクエスチョンです。この組織のパーパス、そしてカルチャーを結ぶ、まず1つ目のところ、この重要性というのをもうちょっとだけ具体的に教えていただけますか。
Competitors can figure out what our business products look like. Competitors could even hire the same kinds of staff that we have. The piece that's really hard for them to mimic is our culture, because it's the secret sauce. Does that translate? It's the DNA, if you will, of what actually makes a culture different. And so when you link not only your understanding of purpose, but then you actually operationalize it through the culture, that's when it becomes dynamic. Another example, forgive me for another US company, I will share some Japanese companies as well as we interact, but perhaps you've heard of Google? Maybe. So, of course, we're all very familiar with Google, and perhaps you're all familiar too that Google has had a long time reputation of saying that a majority of their staff get 20% of their time to innovate anywhere within the company. It might not even be directly related to their role. This worked very well with Silicon Valley culture that was all about break things, move in and disrupt things, etc. As they began to expand and hire staff in Japan, recruiters and interviewers would sit down with a Japanese individual and say, if we were to hire you, you would have 20% of your time to innovate any way you like within the company. What might you do with that 20% of your time? Being very title conscious, the Japanese job candidate would say, whatever the boss told me to do. No. But if you could just innovate anywhere, what would you do? Well, I would need to know what the boss's rubric is for how I'm going to be measured. Google understood what was happening here. They knew there was a cultural difference between traditional Japanese culture and Silicon Valley culture, but they also knew, because they were advised by some culture consultants, just get rid of the 20% thing in Japan. Google's like, no, then we will lose a core part of our organizational purpose and culture. So what they did is they retained the 20%, but they modified the way that they interviewed for that. There are very innovative people all across Japan. Look at the innovations that Japan has led for decades, but it gets manifested in a way that's different than what it looks like from a brash cowboy American. And so the interviewers had to find ways to say, talk to me about a time when you've changed the way that you were approaching something. What's an idea that you have that you wish your current company would do something more with? It was allowing them to still sort of discern whether or not there were innovative skills there without it having to look like an American form of it.
パーパスとカルチャーが一致してなきゃいけないというのは、ちゃんと制度として背中を押せる角度で提示しているかというのが非常に重要になってくるわけなんですね。では続いて2つ目いきましょう。水平的ダイバーシティと垂直的ダイバーシティ。今こちらにもね出ているわけなんですが、これだけ聞いただけだとちょっとわかりづらい。もうちょっとだけ整理していただけますか。
Yes, this is a bit technical, but I think hopefully as I explain it, it's quite easy to grasp. So usually when we talk about cultural differences, we talk about them as not being good or bad, just different. And I was even careful to say that when you asked about titles. The importance of titles is not bad, it's just different. If we were to look at our differences, the horizontal differences would be things like, I'm going to make this up here, but perhaps Sakiku-san is very direct and David-san is very indirect, okay? Maybe it's that I'm very punctual and you're a procrastinator. So not good or bad, just different. So that's what we usually focus on in cultural training. Don't judge, it's just different. What vertical diversity gets at is to say, Japanese versus American or direct, indirect are not the only differences between us. There's a difference in who has the most power here. Now, in our dynamic, I'm not sure. I'm not sure because you control the questions, but, you know, I'm the guest coming in that has a certain area of understanding. So it's maybe not as clear-cut in our relationship, but in a workplace, the most obvious one might be who has the title, but what about engineers versus HR? Depends on which organization that you're in. What about the person who is very logically oriented versus someone who's more expressive and emotional? So vertical diversity says it's not enough to only control for the neutral differences. You also have to go into any situation, scan it and say, who has the most power here and who doesn't, and how is that impacting what actually happens in this situation? By the way, and who has the power changes, because we don't know each other well enough yet, but if we go to a pop culture event, I'm guessing you're going to have more power than I am in understanding what's going on. Maybe. But the situation, even to use a more specific example, if you're talking about a tech company, an engineer would absolutely have more power. If you're with a consultancy like Ideal Leaders, maybe not. Maybe they aren't as comfortable with the ambiguity for the kind of consulting that needs to happen.
私の今の整理で言うと、ホリゾンタルというのは、非常に可視化しやすい多分違いなんであろうと。で、垂直の多様性というのはどちらかというと、あんまり見えづらい。で、見えづらいんだけれども、よくよく蓋を開けてみると、シチュエーションごとにも変わってくるという、結構トリッキーなものなんだなということが非常によくわかりました。じゃあ、このなぜ2つの両立が必要なのか。バーティカルだけでもダメだし、ホリゾンタルだけでもダメ。ここはなぜなんでしょうか。
So the importance of both is if you only focus on the horizontal, you may be missing a power dynamic that exists in the situation. So sometimes I think those of us in the culture space are too quick to only point to a cultural difference as what's going on, and we may have missed altogether that there's a status difference between individuals. Of course, a place like Japan is much more conscious of the importance of context, but there may be other individuals that you're working with, especially as you think about being in a global leadership role where the context is not going to be as pertinent in their minds, so you might have to be mindful of how that plays itself out. The other factor can be sometimes you might have someone who's the boss who actually has less power in a team than somebody who might be friends with the CEO out in a social environment. And so if you haven't considered that power dynamic and you're just looking at the roles or you're just looking at the cultural differences, you may not have accounted for that critical difference in how the team collaborates.
いや、面白いですね。でもこれ本当に企業単位だけの話じゃなくて、国だったりとか、世界の方向性を変えるかもしれないくらい大きな力があるというのは、ちょっと私の中では驚きとともに怖さも感じちゃったんですけれども、3つ目です。心理的安全性と知的誠実さの両立の大切さ。これが3つ目だったと思うんですけれども、改めてどういう定義がそれぞれにできるのか、そこから教えていただけますか。
So psychological safety is giving someone in the workplace the safety to feel like they will be accepted, that they can make mistakes and they won't be at risk. And intellectual honesty is the ability to speak forthrightly about your opinion. So those are some quick definitions of the two.
これで言うと、例えば私、日本人です。で、日本人だからどちらかに偏ってるっていうのも言えたりするんでしょうか？
Many Japanese companies that I observe and work with, psychological safety means that we all sit together and we typically agree with what the most senior people have said. And psychological safety would mean that you wouldn't voice disagreement because that's going to mean that it doesn't feel very safe anymore. To sort of speak in extremes, because there are many, many Japanese companies for whom that is not true, and I'll say the other that's true for the US tends to bias more toward intellectual honesty. And so to use Google as an example again, the former Google executive actually wrote a book, Radical Candor, that says we should be ruinous with one another, forget empathy, we need to just speak forthrightly with one another because that's how innovation happens. But of course, if people don't feel safe, if they feel attacked, it's very unlikely that innovation is going to happen. So one without the other, the diagram sort of shows us that. If you just emphasize psychological safety, you tend to resort to groupthink, that everybody's just going to sort of nod along. Whereas if you only have intellectual honesty, you feel anxious. You don't want to speak up because you don't want to suddenly have someone attack you with the new idea that you've shared.
今のところで2つお伺いしたくて、1つは日本ではこの心理的安全性が強いと。で、そんな中でもっとできるだけインテレクチャルアネスティに寄らせたい。この時にどうするのか。これが1つ目。で、2つ目は日本の PS が強い中、心理的安全性が強い中で、私みたいにとってもインテレクチャルアネスティ、知的誠実性の方が強い人がいる。どうここをコンプラマイズし、妥協し、皆さんといいコミュニケーションが取れるのか、この2つを整理して教えていただきたいです。
So to the first point, particularly because title and hierarchy has a strong level of importance in many Japanese organizations, the psychological safety and intellectual honesty equation is going to have to be led by the leaders themselves. It's often said the leader's idea carries inordinate weight. In a group conversation, even if they say, I want you to disagree with me, I want you to challenge me. So that would be one piece. Another would be to account for the fact that people are not used to bosses necessarily expecting intellectual honesty, and to demonstrate it by saying, I would like you to form groups of 3 or 4 together, put together your ideas of what's here, submit them if necessary, even anonymously, so that we can then curate some of those opportunities to look at what's happening here. So it starts with leadership, especially in a hierarchical culture, but even in more low power distant cultures, it has to start with leadership. That would be a couple tangible ways for it to happen. One more thing that I would say is oftentimes what leaders will say is, I want your input. I want you to share with me what you think about this idea. But if we don't explicitly say that it's an expectation, then many people will just sort of decide that they're not going to actually do it. So being very explicit and concrete that I am asking everyone to form an opinion on this and submit it to me by 5 o'clock Friday at the close of business, then that helps, use the authority in a positive way to say it's there. I really like your second question. What do you do if you don't fit the norm yourself and you're mindful that you're somehow an anomaly in your own culture? By the way, this is a big part of cultural intelligence, our own self-awareness. It's one of the reasons why I get tired of all the broad stereotypes of how the Japanese are and how the Koreans are and how the Germans are, how the millennials are, how engineers are. Which one are we talking about? So part of it is to be true to ourselves, but what cultural intelligence allows us to do is to adjust the way that I'm using my intellectual honesty in a way that will suit the context in the situation. Maybe I can sort of reverse it a different way. So as somebody who has spent a lot of my time in the US, and I grew up in New York. So New York as a communication style has a very direct, blunt communication style. You say what you mean what you say. If you're upset with someone, you just let them know it. As I've learned throughout the years and having spent a number of years living in Asia, I realized that there are many times, particularly if I had an authority position, that somebody wasn't just going to bluntly tell me that they disagreed with me. And so one of the slight adjustments that I would make, instead of just saying, tell me how you think that meeting went, or how was my presentation, which, what is the typical indirect hierarchical person going to say, it was wonderful, boss, you were amazing, I have nothing more to say. One of the ways that I might adjust it is say, so if other people were to share some of their thinking from what they heard from that presentation, what might be some of the things that they would say to you about that, etc. Now you've depersonalized it a bit. It's not, Sukiku-san, what do you think about me and my presentation? But what might, that you wouldn't say this, but what might they have said? It uses cultural intelligence to just slightly adjust what I'm trying to accomplish without actually causing the individual to lose face or to feel uncomfortable in the way that they're doing it.
いや、これすごく、ちょっとイベントなのでせっかくなのでお伺いしたいなと思うんですけれども、心理的安全性の方がちょっと高いかもっていう人ってどれぐらいいらっしゃいます？あんまり上がらないです。だいぶ上がりました。じゃあ、私と同じく知的誠実性の方が多い方。結構上がりましたね。やっぱり日本人の中でもかなり分かれるんだなというところがあるというところで言うと、私と同じ悩み抱えている方きっといらっしゃると思うんですよ。そこで今のような自分じゃないけれど、周りだったらこう言うんじゃないという、ある意味クッションを作ってあげるというのが重要なんですね。
Yes, exactly. And particularly if they don't know you as well and don't have the relationship to do it, it allows them for the bluntness in a way that's appropriate. So how many think I'm speaking too fast? Intellectual honesty. Oh, nobody. Okay, good. I'm going to start speaking more quickly.
それが一番良くない CQ の例かもしれないですね。ではさらに深掘っていきましょうか。CQ を中心とした組織どうやって作るんですかの答えを一言で言うとしたら、先ほどリーダーシップから始まるっておっしゃってたと思うんですよね。そのリーダーシップってどうやって育てるんでしょうか
？Three things. First of all, the leaders that are in place have to cast the vision and the mission for it. So it has to become part of anything that's talked about. We've just hired a new person. They're really committed to cultural intelligence. They have a lot of global experience. Look for a way to build it into that. The second piece, I've learned this the hard way in my own organizational leadership, is it has to be built into policies and procedures. When I first started the Cultural Intelligence Center, I was not a policy and procedures guy. Do we really need a policy for this? You hire good people, you let them figure out how to manage someone, you trust people to be integrous with their tech, and then suddenly as we had more and more managers, we found out that different managers had very different interpretations of what it meant to be lenient about working from home, etc. So policies and procedures start to codify cultural intelligence. And then the third one is through learning and development. That through coaching, through workshops, through opportunities for peer reflection and that's where cultural intelligence really starts to get developed, where it's not just sitting in a classroom and listening to someone like me lecture about it, but where people have a chance to bring their real team situations and talk it through a cultural intelligence lens.
いや、非常に示唆深いお話ありがとうございます。じゃあ最後にですね、私からの、ここはどうなんですかというところもお伺いしたいところなんですが、やっぱりこの CQ を目的にしちゃうと、自分を殺しちゃう人とかも出てきちゃうと思うんですよね。例えば、自分はこの組織をより CQ を高めるために、自分のアイデンティティをできるだけなくしていこう、薄くしていこう、そういうふうになってしまいがちな人たちも出てくるんじゃないかなと思うんですが、そこら辺の懸念っていかがですか？
Excellent question. One of the great dangers of applying CQ, if we aren't careful about it, is we lose ourselves, we may lose our organizational purpose, and even a national identity, which I think is part of what we may be seeing happening in terms of politics. Cultural intelligence is about adapting behaviors. It's not about adapting the core of who we are. And an example I shared with you when we talked previously is I think about this as a dad. I have two daughters, very proud of my daughters. I have photos I would love to show you later. My daughters today are 26 and 28, but today, as well as when they were little, they're very different from one another. My 28-year-old is a lawyer in a big law firm, and even as a little kid, she liked to her idea of a fun outing with dad was to debate some issue together, have a wonderful meal over a long evening. My younger daughter, she wants to be moving, doing 4 different activities in about 20 minutes time, and they're still that way. So I relate to them very, very differently. But my hope is if Emily and Grace were to talk with each other, they do talk with each other, but if they were to talk with each other about me as a dad, they wouldn't say, "You had a totally different father than I did." They both experience my love, but the behaviors look very different for them based upon their personalities. That's what we're after with cultural intelligence. We're not saying you as a leader have to be different than who you are. If you're more inclined toward intellectual honesty, maybe just soften the intellectual honesty edge a little bit. If you're somebody who's more inclined towards psychological safety and you're not as comfortable with intellectual honesty, exert yourself a bit more to be a bit more forthright and frank than you might typically do. So I really appreciate the question. It was why I wanted to clarify it. We don't want cultural intelligence to mean I'm suppressing myself or suppressing the organization. To try and be all things to all people is not a very desirable place to be and not very effective.
本当に自分のコアがあって、その組織にコアがあってこそ、最初におっしゃってた、だからこそ組織のパーパスというところが何よりも大事なんだ。そこにつながっていくんだなというのが、すごく私の中で腑に落ちました。改めてですね、最後に、もう私が多分聞ききれてなかったところ、もっとここ聞きたかったというところ、たくさんあったと思うんですが、CQ についての理解をさらに深める本が、アイディールリーダーズより出版されております。強い組織は違いを楽しむ。CQ が切り開く組織文化。監修は実はデイビッドさんがされているんです。本当にこの本の注目点、内容についてもしよければブリーフにお伝えしていただければなと思うんですが、いかがでしょうか。
Absolutely. So the book, of course, is written by Miyamura-san, and we've been privileged to know one another for over a decade. One of the things that I so appreciate about Chika is both her interpersonal warmth and her ability to be about business strategy and purpose. And that really comes through in this book. It talks about cultural intelligence in a very Japan-rich kind of way with a lot of Japanese examples. She brings the kinds of things that I have talked about at a very high level down to earth with a lot of rich ways to apply it. And then finally, these 3 points of building the CQ-driven organizations are all things that are covered in the book: aligning organizational purpose with culture, horizontal and vertical diversity, and intellectual honesty and psychological safety. Cultural intelligence at the organizational level has not had nearly as much attention as it has at the individual level. This is one of the first publications in the world to be published on CQ at the organizational level. So I highly encourage individuals to check out the book and to look for ways to apply it in their organization.
今一度デイビッドさんに盛大な拍手をお送りくださいませ。